Welcome to Essays from a Strange Country, a podcast about exploring Australian identity. Each episode, through the lens of what our culture has produced, such as an Australian film, literature, art, and music, to ask how this country has imagined itself and who has been conveniently left out of the portrait. We'll look at the bush myth, the beach fantasy, suburbia, exile, class, race, masculinity, silence, noise, and the enduring national talent for pretending discomfort is just having a laugh. And I'm your host, Jasmine Wolfe. Why Australian stories are unlike anything else on earth. Australian storytelling is odd in the best possible sense. Ancient, restless, funny in the dark, and permanently suspicious of anyone trying to make it respectable. Its uniqueness does not come from a tidy national character, because Australia has never had one of those, despite repeated attempts involving beaches, bush hats, and government arts funding. It comes instead from a deeper collision, the world's oldest continuous storytelling traditions, meeting a settler culture still trying to work out whether it belongs here, owns here, fears here, or is merely renting emotionally. At the center of this collision is country. In Aboriginal storytelling, land is not scenery. It is not the painted backdrop behind human drama, waiting politely for someone with cheekbones to suffer against it. Country is alive, lawful, ancestral, and active. Stories carry knowledge about creation, kinship, food, water, medicine, navigation, responsibility, and survival. They are maps, archives, moral systems, and memory technologies, often at the same time. The dreaming is not a quaint, mythological cupboard into which Europeans may file belief. It is a living structure of law and relation, one that makes Western divisions between education, art, religion, and geography look rather clumsy. Modern Australian storytelling inherits this ground, though often uneasily. Settler narratives tend to turn the landscape into a problem, too vast, too silent, too bright, too empty. Empty, of course, being the old colonial fantasy doing its usual grubby work. Australian Gothic reverses the European tradition by making the bush not a decorative wilderness, but a force that exposes invasion, denial, and psychic rot. In Aboriginal Gothic and Mabern reality, the supernatural is not an exotic disruption of ordinary life. It is part of reality's ordinary furniture, whether or not European realism has the manners to notice. Contemporary Australian film and literature also carry a more recent burden, cultural cringe, that national reflex of assuming anything local must be second-rate until praised overseas by someone with the correct accent. Against Hollywood's long shadow, Australian stories have developed a sharp, ironic, larrikin sensibility, comic, bleak, self-puncturing, and allergic to grandeur. Their distinctiveness lies in this unresolved mix: ancient lore and modern doubt, sacred geography and suburban embarrassment, ancestral presence and imported television. No wonder the stories are strange. They come from a continent where the land speaks, the colonizer panics, and the punchline usually arrives with a bruise. Any serious account of Australian storytelling has to begin with Aboriginal narrative traditions, not as a quaint preface before the real national literature turns up wearing shoes, but as the continent's foundational narrative system. Long before Australia became a settler nation, fretting about whether London, New York, or Los Angeles had noticed it, Aboriginal communities were using story to organise law, memory, ecology, kinship, spirituality, geography, and survival. That is not a romantic flourish. It is a practical description of a knowledge system that has endured for tens of thousands of years, which is a fairly decent record compared with most modern cultural institutions, many of which struggle to survive a change in funding policy. Aboriginal storytelling is often misunderstood when forced into Western categories such as myth, folklore, religion, art, or entertainment. These labels are not entirely useless, but they are badly underpowered. They separate things that Aboriginal narrative systems commonly hold together. The dreaming is not once upon a time, with better scenery. It is a framework in which creation, law, and responsibility remain active. Time is not a dead line stretching neatly from primitive origins to modern enlightenment. It is layered, recurring, and embedded in country. This is one reason Aboriginal stories are unlike most Western narrative traditions. In much European-derived storytelling, a story may teach a lesson, but it is usually still treated as a story first. Education is an add-on, like vegetables hidden in a child's dinner. Aboriginal narrative does not operate with that tidy division. The information is not abstract. It concerns how to live. It tells people where water can be found, which plants heal, which foods are seasonal, which places require caution, which relationships are permitted, which obligations must be honoured, and which forms of conduct threaten social and ecological balance. In other words, these stories are not decorative cultural property. They are infrastructure. The sophistication of this system lies partly in what might be called brilliant redundancy. Modern bureaucracies love redundancy too, usually in the form of 7 identical forms submitted to 3 departments, none of whom talk to each other. Aboriginal narrative redundancy is rather more elegant. A single body of knowledge may be preserved through spoken narrative, song, dance, painting, carving, sand drawing, body design, and ceremonial performance. These are not separate illustrations of the story. They are interlocking modes of transmission. Each reinforces the others. Oral recitation carries sequence and detail. Song fixes rhythm, place, and movement in memory. Dance embodies the knowledge physically. Visual designs encode relationships and roots. Ceremony places the knowledge within communal authority and obligation. The effect is a resilient archive without shelves, servers, or the false confidence of a password-protected database. This multiform structure also allows stories to work at different levels for different audiences. A child may learn one version of a narrative as a memorable account of animals, ancestors, or landscape. Adults may understand deeper legal, spiritual, and ecological meanings. Initiated custodians may hold further restricted knowledge. This layered structure matters because it resists the lazy assumption that oral traditions are simple because they are not written down. Writing is not the universal gold standard of intelligence, despite what universities sometimes imply while charging library fines. Aboriginal storytelling preserves knowledge through performance, repetition, place-based memory, and social responsibility. Its authority does not come from being fixed on a page. It comes from being kept alive under the care of people with obligations to it. The distinctiveness of Australian storytelling begins here, with a narrative tradition in which story is not an escape from the world, but a disciplined way of knowing it. The land, the body, the law, the ancestors, the seasons, and the community are not split into separate subjects for administrative convenience. They are held together through story. This makes Aboriginal narrative both ancient and intensely practical. It is spiritual without being detached from material life, educational without being reduced to instruction, artistic without being merely aesthetic. That combination unsettles Western assumptions about what stories are supposed to do. It also complicates any easy claim that Australian storytelling simply begins with settler literature, bush ballads, convict tales, or films about emotionally constipated men standing in dust. Those traditions matter, but they arrive late. The deeper foundation is Aboriginal. Australian stories are unlike anything else because they emerge from a continent already storied in dense, living and legally charged ways long before colonisation attempted to rename, fence, survey and misunderstand it. The result is not just a different archive of tales, it is a different theory of narrative itself. Story is law, story is map, story is memory, story is survival. Not bad, really, for something too often dismissed as myth by people whose own national legends include heroic explorers getting lost and calling it discovery. Country is active. It remembers, instructs, punishes, nourishes, and speaks. It is not merely where stories happen, it is often the main intelligence within the story itself. This is one of the sharpest distinctions between many Australian stories and dominant Western narrative traditions. In much European storytelling, landscape tends to function as setting: forest, mountain, desert, sea. It may be symbolic, even sublime, but it usually remains subordinate to human action. The hero crosses it, conquers it, gets lost in it, or has a meaningful personal crisis while looking at it. Very moving, no doubt. In Aboriginal storytelling, by contrast, country is relational rather than decorative. It is not owned in the ordinary property sense, it is belonged to. This helps explain why Australian storytelling so often resists the imported habit of treating place as passive. The continent's narrative logic does not begin with empty space. The colonial fantasy of terra nullius depended on precisely that fiction, that the land was blank, unused, and waiting for improvement, preferably by sheep, fences, and paperwork. The settler eye saw wilderness partly because it did not know how to read what was in front of it. This is less a failure of vision than a national talent. Even in later Australian cinema and literature, including works not strictly Indigenous in authorship, the landscape often refuses to behave as mere background. Films such as Picnic at Hanging Rock and Jindabyne present the Australian environment as charged, unstable, and morally unsettling. The bush is not just bush. It absorbs people, hides violence, disturbs linear explanation, and unsettles imported assumptions about reason and control. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, the landscape becomes an object of desire and dread, a presence that defeats neat interpretation. The missing girls are not simply lost in nature, they are swallowed by a place that seems to operate according to laws beyond colonial comprehension, which admittedly is a low bar. Similarly, Jindabyne uses landscape as a site of buried violence and unresolved guilt. The river is not a neutral location where a body is found. It becomes a moral force, exposing the failures of the men who encounter it and the broader social world they represent. The land holds what people would rather not face. This is a recurring pattern in Australian storytelling. Place remembers what the nation edits out. The bush, river, desert, and rock formation often become witnesses, even accusers. They do not need dialogue. They have been putting up with us for some time. What makes this distinctively Australian is not simply that the landscape is harsh or beautiful, though it is regularly both. Plenty of national literatures have dramatic scenery and weather with emotional problems. The difference lies in the depth of narrative agency granted to place. Through Aboriginal traditions, country is understood as animate, storied, and ethically binding. Through later Gothic and cinematic forms, that older sense of presence often reappears in altered shape as mystery, unease, ancestral force, or ecological judgment. Australian stories therefore inherit a landscape that cannot be reduced to setting because it has never been merely set. It acts, it remembers, it makes claims. This is why the Australian story world is so difficult to translate into simple frontier mythology. The American frontier myth typically imagines land as something to be mastered, settled, and converted into destiny with a straight face and a large flag. Australian stories are less confident, and usually with good reason. Here, the land does not reliably affirm human ambition. It resists ownership, mocks certainty, and carries histories older than the language used to deny them. Country is not waiting for narrative. It already is narrative. The task is not to invent meaning upon it, but to listen without immediately ruining the place. Australian Gothic has always had a fairly obvious problem. It was imported with the luggage. The Gothic tradition arrived as part of the broader British cultural kit, along with property law, racial hierarchy, bad architecture, and a touching confidence that Europe was the centre of human civilization. In Britain, Gothic fiction tended to stage fear through haunted castles, ancestral curses, decaying aristocracies, and the occasional woman wandering about in a nightdress. In Australia, this machinery had to be retrofitted to a landscape that did not care for European symbolism. No castles, no medieval ruins, just heat, distance, scrub, silence, and the unnerving suspicion that the country was not empty at all. The result was the Imperial Gothic, a colonial genre built around anxiety. It turned the colonized land into a scene of danger and the indigenous inhabitant into a figure of terror. Aboriginal people were repeatedly represented as primitive, violent, spectral, or barely human, the usual colonial greatest hits, performed with all the moral subtlety of a brick through a window. In this mode, the Gothic monster was often the Aboriginal body itself, made strange by the settler imagination, and then blamed for being strange. The bush became a hostile labyrinth. The frontier became a nightmare zone. Aboriginal presence became a threat to white order, as though the real horror were not invasion, dispossession, massacre, and forced removal, but the possibility that settlers might feel uncomfortable about them. Contemporary Aboriginal Gothic reverses this structure with quiet savagery. It does not merely insert Aboriginal characters into an old European form. It turns the form against its original owners. The monster is no longer the indigenous person haunting the edge of settlement. The monster is settlement. The source of terror is not Aboriginal spirituality, kinship, or attachment to country, but the machinery of colonisation. The mission, the archive, the police file, the protector, the anthropologist, the welfare officer, the expert with a clipboard and a theory about blood quantum. The Gothic, in Aboriginal hands, becomes less a genre of superstition than a genre of historical accuracy. It reveals what polite national memory would rather keep under the veranda. This reversal matters because it changes the moral geography of Australian storytelling. In Imperial Gothic, the settler subject stands at the centre, frightened by the land and by those who belong to it. In Aboriginal Gothic, that centre collapses. White Australia becomes uncanny to itself. Its institutions appear not as rational instruments of progress, but as grotesque systems of surveillance and control. The familiar colonial claim that Europeans brought law, order, and reason starts to look less like history and more like public relations. Aboriginal Gothic exposes the violence hidden beneath bureaucratic language. Assimilation becomes bodily destruction. Protection becomes captivity. Civilization becomes erasure with paperwork. This is where Mabin reality becomes crucial. The term refers to a distinctly Aboriginal way of representing reality in which spiritual forces, ancestral presence, country, memory, and everyday experience are not neatly separated. Western realism, being very pleased with itself, tends to divide the world into the rational and the supernatural. One is serious, the other is decorative, childish, or genre fiction. Modern reality refuses that split. It does not treat the spiritual as a metaphor pasted onto ordinary life. It treats it as part of ordinary life. That distinction is not cosmetic. In Aboriginal storytelling, country is alive with ancestral force, law, memory, and obligation. The unseen is not necessarily unreal. The dead are not necessarily absent. The past is not safely past, which is inconvenient for a settler nation deeply invested in pretending otherwise. Marban reality therefore challenges European literary expectations at the level of form. It does not ask permission from realism. It does not pause to explain itself to readers trained to expect a tidy distinction between history and myth, fact and spirit, event and memory. Instead, it presents a world in which these categories overlap because, within Aboriginal epistemologies, they do. Kim Scott's Benang offers a powerful example of this Gothic reconstruction. The novel deals with assimilation, eugenics, and the colonial obsession with breeding Aboriginality out of existence, a project so morally diseased that even calling it policy feels generous. Scott uses Gothic bodily imagery to represent the psychic and physical violence of these systems. Bodies in Benang are not stable, whole, or securely self-possessed. They are catalogued, measured, classified, manipulated, and broken by the colonial archive. Identity becomes something administered from outside, as though a person could be reduced to fractions, files, and official suspicion. The protagonist Harley's strange propensity for elevation is especially important. His floating body is not a quirky, magical, realist flourish, the sort of thing a reviewer might praise while missing the point entirely. It dramatizes the condition of rootlessness produced by assimilation. Harley is literally lifted away from ground, ancestry, and secure belonging. His elevation signals disconnection from country and from the histories that colonial systems have tried to sever, yet it also marks the failure of those systems to fully define him. He is unsettled but not erased, suspended but not contained. Scott's use of Gothic disintegration also exposes the horror of colonial eugenics as an assault on embodiment itself. The colonial state does not merely occupy land, it attempts to reorganize flesh. It turns ancestry into data, kinship into a problem, and children into material for social engineering. In this context, the Gothic body becomes the right form for the wrong history. Fragmented bodies, unstable identities, ghostly inheritances, and distorted genealogies are not exaggerations. They are what happens when a society tries to build itself on theft and then insists everyone admire the landscaping. Aboriginal Gothic and Marban reality therefore make Australian storytelling unlike more conventional Western narrative traditions because they refuse the comforts of distance. The Gothic is not set in some remote medieval past. The haunting is not safely fictional. The terror is modern, administrative, and national. It lives in institutions, in family histories, in the archive, and in country itself. By reversing the colonial other, Aboriginal writers do more than correct representation. They expose the settler imagination as the haunted thing. This is the sharp edge of Australian storytelling. The land remembers, the dead remain present, and history keeps returning, no matter how often the nation tries to change the subject. If Indigenous storytelling establishes one deep source of Australian narrative distinctiveness, modern Australian culture supplies another, rather less noble one. A national habit of doubting whether anything made here can be any good until someone overseas pats it on the head. This is the old cultural cringe, that stubborn colonial aftertaste in which Australian art is treated as provincial unless validated by Britain, America, or some suitably damp European festival audience. A story can be written, performed, filmed, praised, and understood in Australia, but for some audiences it still needs London hearing before it becomes legitimate. Apparently, the local ear is not to be trusted with local noise. The cultural cringe matters because it shapes not only how Australian stories are received, but also how they are made. It produces a strange double consciousness. Australian writers and filmmakers are asked to be recognisably Australian, but not too Australian, original but exportable, local but not parochial, funny but preferably in a way that will not alarm Americans. The result is a national storytelling culture that often turns its insecurity into style. Australian stories tend to know they are being watched from elsewhere. They carry the tension between wanting to speak in a local idiom and knowing that global markets may find that idiom a bit too dry, too bleak, too blunt, or too busy, refusing to explain itself. The cringe, then, is not just embarrassment. It is an organising pressure. It pushes Australian storytelling towards irony, self-deflation, and suspicion of grandeur. A nation unsure of its cultural authority becomes very good at mocking authority in general. This is where larrikinism enters, dragging its boots through the polished hallway of respectable national identity. The larrikin is not simply a comic rebel or lovable nuisance. That would be too tidy and therefore suspicious. As a storytelling mode, larrikinism works through irreverence, anti-authoritarianism, verbal cheek, and a refusal to perform solemnity on command. It is closely tied to Australian humour, which often depends on taking the mickey rather than delivering neat jokes with a ribbon on top. The target may be politicians, bosses, institutions, national myths, or the self, especially the self. Australian humour often begins from the assumption that anyone taking themselves too seriously is asking for trouble and possibly deserves it. That humour is frequently dark, self-defeating, and allergic to uplift. This is not because Australian stories lack emotion, but because emotion is often routed through understatement. A catastrophe may be met with a shrug, a joke, or a line so dry it should come with a bushfire warning. This tonal pattern distinguishes many Australian narratives from mainstream American storytelling, where optimism, redemption, and therapeutic clarity often arrive on schedule, like a well-funded rescue helicopter. Australian humour is less likely to reassure. It is more likely to puncture the moment just when sentiment threatens to become respectable. The effect can be disorienting for audiences trained to expect warmth to announce itself clearly and trauma to resolve into personal growth. Australian stories are often less generous than that. They prefer ambiguity, discomfort, and the small mercy of not saying the obvious thing out loud. This comic style is not merely decorative. It reflects a broader cultural relationship to power and belonging. Larrikin humour allows Australian stories to distrust hierarchy without necessarily proposing revolution, which is very on-brand, mutiny, but with a smirk and no paperwork. It can expose pretension, soften despair, and create solidarity among characters who would rather die than admit they need comfort. Yet it also has limits. The same anti-seriousness that punctures authority can become a way of avoiding difficult history. Jokes can challenge power. They can also let everyone off the hook. In this sense, Australian irony is both a strength and a liability. It gives the national story its bite, but sometimes blunts the blade just when it should cut deeper. The modern paradox is that these highly specific storytelling habits exist inside an aggressively unequal global media economy. Australian stories may be culturally distinctive, but distinctiveness does not pay for prime time slots by itself. The local screen industry operates against the immense gravitational pull of American content, which arrives in bulk, polished by industrial scale, and sold into smaller markets at prices local producers cannot match. This is the problem often described as content dumping, the cheap importation of high-budget foreign material into a market where domestic production costs remain stubbornly domestic. Hollywood does not need to conquer Australia by force. It can simply arrive at a discount, which is much tidier. The danger is not that Australians will watch American stories. They always have, and cultural purity is usually just nationalism wearing a clean shirt. The danger is structural crowding, when imported content fills schedules and platforms because it is cheaper, safer, and already globally promoted. Local stories lose visibility. They do not disappear because audiences actively reject them. They disappear because the market has quietly arranged for them not to appear often enough to matter. This is why local content quotas have been so important. They are not sentimental charity for artists who own too many black turtlenecks. They are a recognition that national storytelling requires infrastructure. If Australian stories are to exist in public, they need more than talent. They need policy, funding, distribution, and screen space. Culture, regrettably, does not thrive on vibes alone. The streaming era sharpens this problem. Traditional broadcasting quotas were built for a world in which national media borders still meant something. Streaming platforms, by contrast, operate across territories while often contributing little to local production. They benefit from Australian subscribers without necessarily investing in Australian stories. This produces a neat little arrangement in which the audience is local, the profit is global, and the cultural obligation is someone else's problem. Without updated regulation, Australian content risks becoming an optional category buried under algorithmic recommendations for whatever has already succeeded elsewhere. The algorithm, bless it, is not known for its commitment to cultural sovereignty, and so modern Australian storytelling sits inside a contradiction. It is marked by a distinctive comic intelligence, ironic, larrikin, self-suspicious, hostile to pomposity, and often darker than outsiders expect. Yet the very industry that carries these stories is vulnerable to cultural insecurity at home and market domination from abroad. The cultural cringe teaches Australians to undervalue their own narratives. Global dumping makes those narratives harder to find. And streaming platforms threaten to turn national storytelling into a niche preference like subtitles or ethical banking. Still, the persistence of Australian stories suggests that this awkwardness is not fatal. In fact, it may be part of the form. Australian storytelling has never depended on smooth confidence. It has grown from collision, ancient and modern, sacred and commercial, local and imported, reverent and rude. Its modern voice is distinctive, precisely because it knows the game is rigged and keeps making jokes at the umpire anyway. That's all for this episode of Essays from a Strange Country. I'm Jasmine Wolfe, and you've been listening to a small attempt to make sense of Australian identity through the things we create when we're not busy avoiding the question entirely. Film, literature, art, and music give us more than cultural decoration. They give us evidence, not clean evidence, obviously. This is Australia, not a filing cabinet, but fragments of how we see ourselves, how we want to be seen, and what we'd rather leave buried under the national veranda. If today's episode has left you with a firmer answer about what Australia is, I'm afraid something has gone wrong. The point is not to solve the country. The point is to notice how often it contradicts itself and how revealing those contradictions can be. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, share it, or mention it vaguely to someone at a barbecue before the conversation collapses into real estate. Until next time, keep reading the margins, watching the background, and listening for what the culture tries not to say. This has been Essays from a Strange Country.